Record. Okay. So, and I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry. I always just start talking like everybody knows me. So, my name is Angela Green, and I'm the coordinator for Philadelphia Chat. When you get emails, it's typically me that's sending those constant contact emails out. So, and then I'm typically also the one that responds to email. So, a lot of people that get on, that's how they know me because we've been corresponding through email. So, I'm very happy to see everyone tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Marcy Caldwell, and she is a wonderful speaker. I've heard her speak before, so I'm very, very excited. And this presentation we have it as being for adults and for families because she gives a lot of information that you can use across the board. Although her practice specializes in adults, this particular topic we thought could go for everybody. So I'm not gonna, because we did put her bio on everything, so I'm not gonna read everything for you, but I'll let you, Dr. Caldwell, I'll let you tell us all the important things. We were talking a little bit about her practice and how they're rebranding because of some advertising issues. So I will stop talking and I'm going to give you the floor. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super thrilled to be here. Let me take a moment to share my screen. Okay, everyone see that? Now I just have to maneuver around my, there we go, that should work. Okay. So today we're going to talk about crafting balance, which is really a strengths-based way of managing the emotional, the practical, and the regulatory aspects of ADHD. So as Angela said, if I can advance my slides, there we go. I'm Marcy Caldwell. I am a clinical psychologist. I am owner and director of what is right now called Rittenhouse Psychological Services, but as Angela mentioned, we are in the process of changing our name and rebranding, likely be something like the Philadelphia ADHD group or ADHD therapy group. If you have any votes, let me know. So that'll be coming in the new year. But you can always just find me by me. That's fine too. I'm also founder of adept.org, which is a blog and digital resource for adults with ADHD, and creator of Meltdown to Mastery, which is a digital course for teaching emotional regulation skills for adults with ADHD. But probably most importantly, I'm a wife and mother in a family full of ADHD. So I come to this topic from all sides and heavily invested. I myself call myself in the kind of the messy middle of ADHD. Once this becomes your specialty, it is very hard for anybody to give you an objective answer as to kind of what your symptoms really are and whether you have ADHD. It can't be tested. And so messy middle feels like the best definition of where I stand in terms of neurodiversity. So let's get started. But really, before we get started, I'd love for you guys to just take a moment. If you're comfortable closing your eyes, great. If not, that's totally fine too. But I'd love for you to just imagine for a moment. So I'd love for you to imagine that you're a runner. And I know it's 7 o'clock at night. It's probably like the last thing on our minds right now is running. But just imagine for a second, you're a runner and you are running a race. And there are lots of different kinds of runners, right? There are people who love ultra marathons. There are people who run short, fast distances like sprinters, right? There are hill sprinters. There are people who love to run up a really steep hill. And there are all kinds of things in between. But you are a marathon runner. You love kind of the long, slow flats. That's kind of where you shine. That is the kind of runner that you are, and that's really what you train for and where you are best suited. And so this race that you're running is kind of made for you. And it is a long, slow, flat marathon. And it's an interesting course because there are actually lots of mountains on the terrain, but the course has been charted to kind of wind around all of those mountains. And so there are only a couple small little hills, and on those hills are tons of people cheering you on, holding up signs, and really kind of pushing you along, giving you everything you need, right? They have water, they have snacks, they got everything you need to get up those hills. And then you have these long, slow flats that are just your dream. Those are what you love. So as you're running this race, think for a moment, how do you feel? You feel pretty good, right? Like this, you're like, yes, this is it. I can show my stuff. I've got what I need. And everything is kind of laid out for me. And you're probably also doing really well, right? You're probably really, far along. You're probably farther in the front because this is your thing, right? Okay, so now I want you to put that runner to the side. And now I want you to imagine you're a different runner altogether. This time, you're running the exact same race, but this time, you're not a marathon runner, you're a hill sprinter. You are somebody who loves to charge up the tallest mountain and then take a break, right? Sit down, have a snack, take a break, get, carted downhill in a car or whatever. And that's where you shine. But this time you are a hill sprinter, but you're running a marathon. So you're running up those hills and all those people are on the hills and you're like, why are they here? This isn't that hard. And then you're on the long, slow flats and there's nobody there, right? There's no support. There's nothing. And you're just charging along, trying your best to keep going. So how do you feel now? Not as good, right? Kind of probably feel a little hopeless. Feel like, why is everybody else so much farther ahead? What's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? So you may have kind of gotten where I'm going with this. Living in our world with ADHD is a lot like running that never-ending marathon, right? That doesn't take advantage of our natural strengths and tends to punish us for our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. And in fact, very often the race of our life kind of tends to actually make us feel bad, right? To feel like that hill sprinter that's like, why can't I do that, right? Because it's not well defined. And so today what I want to talk about is we're not going to talk about evening the playing fields. We're not going to do that. We're also not going to talk about how to just run our own race, right? And just let ADHD brains kind of go off and run those hill sprints. What I really want to talk about is kind of widening the course, right? Kind of opening up the things that ADHD brains do so well and celebrating those and using those while also supporting them in the places where they're vulnerable. So I want to talk about capitalizing on these incredible strengths of ADHD brains and also offering structure and vulnerability for the weaknesses. But I want to make sure that we do this in two ways. So the way we do this is really kind of hitting a balance, right? Hitting a balance in ADHD treatment or management, however you want to call it. And we do this in two ways. We do this by making sure that we're talking about all aspects of the ADHD experience, so that I call that kind of balanced content. So we're making sure that we're not just hitting one part of the ADHD experience, but really kind of looking at all of it. And then I also want to talk about our approach, because we don't want to just kind of send a whole bunch of sunshine and rainbows at ADHD, right? They're real struggles and real suffering that can come with ADHD. And so we want to make sure that we are helping and supporting that, but we also don't want to ignore the strengths and ignore the things that ADHD brains do so well. And so we want to take this very balanced approach where we're looking at both sides of that and helping to shore up those vulnerabilities while also bringing forward and celebrating and capitalizing on the strengths. So that's what we're going to do today. So when I talked about kind of the balanced content, which is where we're going to start, what I mean by that is that we're looking at all aspects of the ADHD experience. So I created this, I called the Adept ADHD triad. And it's really just kind of a heuristic that I use to define the three aspects of the ADHD experience as it kind of shows up in the literature and in the research, and how they all connect. And so we're going to be looking at the regulatory aspects, the practical aspects, and the emotional aspects. So we're going to start with the regulatory. And the regulatory aspects of the ADHD experience is really the core difference in ADHD brains. So it's the ADHD brain's natural inclination to kind of go all in or all out, right? It's the hill sprinter. And research shows that this is true in all domains, that ADHD brains tend to kind of go into these extremes, motorically, cognitively, emotionally, physiologically. And so the way I often explain this is I like to think of neurotypical brains as being like a mixing board in a fancy sound studio, right? So they have all these dimmer switches, right? Huge board full of dimmer switches, which allows the neurotypical brain to get to just the right level, right? Just the right volume so that the kid can whisper to their friend next to them and not be heard by the teacher. Just enough attention so you can kind of pay attention at your 9 o'clock meeting, but still have enough left over for your 4 o'clock meeting. Or, you know, paying just enough attention to research or getting just enough into research that you can get an answer, but not go diving down a spiraling hole of research rabbit hole. And so neurotypical brains are really good at this. They're really good at doing that just enough effort, just enough energy, just enough focus, just enough emotion. And just enough is great. It allows neurotypical brains to kind of go on and on and on. It's that slow and steady. It's the turtle that we were all taught to praise and admire when we were a kid, because they were bound to finish first in the long run, right? And ADHD brains, they are no turtles. They love a good hill sprint, and then they want to take a nap in the shade. So to extend the metaphor, ADHD brains have that same kind of huge board, right? Just as many switches, but rather than dimmer switches, ADHD brains tend to have a whole lot of on-off switches. So they go all in or all out, and they fall to these extremes. There you have hyper focus or no focus. Big feelings are kind of like, I'm cool, I'm not really feeling much at all. They're sensing all the things or missing key details. And in our slow and steady wins the race kind of marathon world, it's really easy to see those downsides of on-off regulation, right? We see all on energy creating interrupting, We see wandering attention, making it hard to complete work. We see impulsivity leading to debt or kind of making bad decisions. But those exact same regulatory extremes in different situations are also strengths. So that all on energy that led to interrupting also makes you the life of the party, right? The wandering attention that made it hard to complete tasks can also result in novel problem solving, because guess where you go when your attention is wandering? Lots of other places that can bring in new information, new ideas. And impulsivity can also be fun and adventuresome and create a lot of spontaneity, right? So we want to harness those strengths. We want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the strength of all of that, while also giving ADHD brains more ability to find that middle ground, to find that just enough spot when they need to too. And so we do this with regulation. And so for those of you who have kids, if you remember back when they were kind of very young toddlers, you probably have had the experience of playing with light switches, right? At least my kids loved light switches. They were constantly kind of climbing up on top of me and playing with the light switch behind me. And so you probably know that, yes, the light switch, it would rather be on or off, but you can actually, if you work really hard at it, hover it somewhere in between for a second, right? Fortunately, ADHD brains can hover for longer than a second, much longer than the light switch can. But it requires energy. It requires effort to find that middle ground, right? Its natural resting space is in on or off, and that middle ground requires energy. And so that energy comes from regulation. And I like to think of the regulation as being powered by almost a battery. And that battery fuels our capacity for tasks or activities that require kind of varying levels of regulation, that require that middle ground. And it fills and it drains based on our actions throughout the day. Okay, so some things will kind of give us more energy in this battery, and some things will drain it. Just like the battery on your phone, right? Like if you're on lots and lots of apps, it's going to drain more quickly. And if you plug it in, it's going to start to fill it up. Well, our brains basically have that same sort of thing. So when we're talking about how do we provide these supports to help the vulnerabilities of the ADHD difference here, when we're talking about it in terms of regulation, what we really want to be talking about and thinking about is how do we charge this battery? Because this battery is what gives us the ability to find that middle ground. So this is where we get into our supports. So there are 6 things that research shows kind of fills this battery, and they are sleep, nutrition, medication, exercise, meditation, and connection. So we're going to dive into each one of those. So number 1 is sleep. And is my personal favorite. I love sleep. And I think we all know ADHD brains have a really tricky relationship with sleep, right? And which is particularly, it's one of these places where the vulnerabilities of the ADHD brain really get in the way of what can help ADHD brains, right? So ADHD brains really struggle with sleep. And in fact, 50% of people with ADHD have a diagnosable sleep disorder. And that's 70% over a lifetime. And so that's particularly problematic because sleep deprivation increases core ADHD symptom severity. So it increases this regulatory difficulty, i.e. drains the battery. In fact, research has found this across the board, and they look at kind of all different kinds of sleep deprivation, but even just 1 hour in one night shows significant poorer attention and focus for folks with ADHD. The good news is that improved sleep improves ADHD symptom severity. So if we don't get enough, we drain our battery. If we get enough, then we give our battery some, right? It kind of improves that ability. Nutrition is number 2. And so when I'm talking about nutrition, the diets and supplements are very controversial. They're controversial because they show there's a lot of conflicting data over kind of which diet works, which doesn't. Almost every single thing that you see, a research study say like, oh, this elimination diet works, or this kind of diet works for ADHD. You will also see an equally reputable study that says, nope, had no impact whatsoever. So there's very little consensus on the type of diet, and very little consensus around supplements, with the maybe exception of omega-3s. But so that's not really what we're talking about today. What we're really talking about is what is very clear in the research and has been for decades, is the importance of maintaining an even blood glucose level. And having that even blood glucose is important because our brains are hungry, really, really hungry. So our brains make up 2% of our total body mass, but they use up 20% of our whole body's blood glucose. So our brains use up way more than their size of all of the energy and sugar within our bodies, right? And so when that starts to dip, which it can dip for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe you haven't eaten in a while, maybe you had some really, simple carbs, sugar, something like that, and then you got a spike and then it dipped again. When it dips, our brains have this decision that they can make, because there's a lot to kind of happen in that brain, right? And so it has this decision of, okay, so I really need every ounce of energy that I can get. And I need to do things like make sure that this body is breathing. I need to make sure that the heart's pumping. I need to make sure that the metabolism's working, right? Like I need to make sure that everything, all of those systems are working. And then there's also this other stuff like decision-making, regulation, attention, that sort of thing. All of a sudden, that doesn't seem so important, right? We don't have enough energy to go around. And so ADHD brains, and all brains, do this when there isn't enough sugar, when the blood sugar level is low, what they do is they tend to pull the resources away from the prefrontal cortex, which is right in the front of the brain, and so that they have enough resources in the interior, which is where all of those survival systems are. And so they actually divert those resources away. And when we do that, we see regulation failures. And this shows up in the research over and over again. Regulation failures of attention, focus, impulsivity, hyperactivity, decision-making, all of the things that our regulatory systems can regulate, we see failures when glucose levels are low. And I just want to note for a moment here that this is extra hard for ADHD brains. This is another thing like sleep where the ADHD vulnerabilities get in the way of the treatment, right? Because it's maintaining a good even blood sugar is really, really hard. There's a lot of executive functioning requirements involved in having kind of the type of diet that keeps a good steady blood sugar. Add to that medication side effects that cause us to not eat for long periods of time, and we have quite an issue here. So those are the two things that kind of fill the battery up to our natural max, right? So if we got lots of great food on board, our blood sugar is nice and even, we got a great night's sleep, we are where our brains are, like the natural max of our brains. That's what we can expect of our brains. But there's still more room. There's more charge that we can still give it. And so this is what I call the boost zone. So the other four are our boosters, the things that can give us more charge for that battery. So booster number one, or regulatory fill-up number three, however we want to be counting this, is exercise. So exercise, even just 20 to 30 minutes of moderate exercise, has been shown to improve processing speed, working memory, planning, problem solving. Now, why is that? It's because when we exercise, we're stressing our brains, but it's a good stress. And our brains respond in kind to that stress by flooding it with all kinds of neurofactors and neurotransmitters. So it floods it with dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, BDNF. All of these chemicals help to fuel that regulatory system. And so for those of you who have ever experimented with this, you probably have known and seen that your focus tends to be better, your motivation tends to be more, right after a workout. And this effect tends to last for about 90 to 120 minutes after the workout, right? That flood is there for that period of time. And that's great. But what's even better is that chronic exercise, which I always think is such a funny term because it sounds so bad, but repeated exercise, which is defined usually in the research as 30 minutes, 3 times a week for 5 or more weeks, it actually increases that benefit. And it increases the benefit in attention, inhibition, emotional, behavioral, and motor control. So all of the regulatory areas. And it does this because when our brain is kind of flooded in that way, our brains say, oh, we want to take advantage of this. And so they actually grow new receptors to take advantage of all of that good stuff. So it actually is changing our brains when we exercise repeatedly. And it's changing our brains so that they can soak up more of that regulatory juice and have that effect in a longer, more chronic sort of way. Okay, number 4, medication. And medication is, of course, the gold standard. Stimulant medications remain the first choice with robust double-blind placebo support. And they show regulation improvement for 70% of adults, 75 to 80% of children, all wonderful. And of course, we all know they're not always well tolerated. They don't always address the complete picture, but they do a lot. And so they're definitely a part of this picture, but they can't be the only thing, right? Which thankfully they're not. We have number 5. This one, meditation. So I always brace myself when I talk about meditation because I know there's a lot of conflicting feelings about meditation in the ADHD community, and I totally get it. Because this idea of kind of sitting still and clearing our thoughts, which I think is what we so often think of with meditation, feels impossible. And it kind of is. And the truth is that there's a lot of variety of meditation. And we're not going to get into all of the variety, but there is a lot of various ways that we can meditate. And some of them are much more accessible for ADHD brains. And which is great because while research is still somewhat early, it's really pretty increasingly definitive that meditation is effective at improving these ADHD regulatory symptoms or vulnerabilities, as I like to call them, and improving executive functioning in adults with ADHD. And just like exercise, that regulatory impact of meditation increases with repeated practice. So the more we do it, the more we utilize this practice, the more impact and the more regulatory capacity we get from it. And that brings us to our last one, which is connection. And research has long looked at the relationship between social connection and health and well-being. And connection lowers anxiety, it lowers depression, it increases self-esteem, it increases lifespan even. And it also has been shown to increase executive functioning capability and improve working memory and increase emotional regulation. So not only is it doing all that great stuff for just kind of general health and well-being, which is great, but it is also shoring up our regulatory capacity. So there you have it. You have your 6 regulatory Phillips that give ADHD brains that capacity to hover between all in and all out for a period of time, right? Our extremes are still going to be our natural resting place. It's still going to be where ADHD brains find their greatest flow, where they feel most at home, right? But the more regulatory supply that we have, the greater opportunity that we have to find the middle ground as well. Okay, so we talked about the regulatory aspects. Let's talk about the practical for a moment. So if the regulatory aspects of ADHD experience were, let's think about them as like the underside of an iceberg, right? They're what's going on underneath. They're that core difference in ADHD brains. The practical is what we see on top. So it's the difference that is visible, right? It's the way the regulatory difference shows up in the world. So it's being motivated by time pressure or being attracted to new and shiny things. It's that not now kind of time horizon. And here again, ADHD brains' natural practical strategies and experiences aren't bad or deficient, right? They're just different. They're different strengths and weaknesses. And ADHD brains are great at the hard sprints, and then they can recover with the best of them, right? So this is another place where we really want to be looking from this kind of balanced perspective. What are the strengths that we can kind of take advantage of and capitalize on? And what are the vulnerabilities that we want to help shore up and protect against? So when we look at the vulnerabilities, we're going to circle back to the strengths in a moment. But when we look at the vulnerabilities, we want to kind of look at strategies. And there are 3 kind of there are 3 forms of this kind of intervention or strategies that we can use for the practical side. And the first is actually those 6 regulatory factors, because those 6 regulatory factors, because it's the underside of the iceberg, right? If we help shore up the underside of the iceberg, we also help with what's on top. So when we have more sleep, when we exercise well, when we take our meds, right? All of those practical things, it's easier to not be late. It's easier to stay focused and not procrastinate, right? Because our regulatory capacity is kind of topped up. But that's not enough, right? It's not enough to just have all of that regulatory capacity. We need more than that. And so this is really where supports and strategies come in. And when I'm talking about supports and strategies, what I'm talking about is the real goal is harnessing our strengths while protecting against those vulnerabilities, right? Because every natural strength has a vulnerability. Hyper-focused, honed in on the wrong thing is a time suck, right? Interest-based motivation without blinders ends up kind of relentless rabbit holing. 24/7 big picture thinking creates paralyzing overwhelm. So we want to harness the strength all while scaffolding and supporting and protecting it against its inherent weaknesses. So how do we do that? I'm going to give you an example about me, actually. So my brain, like many ADHD brains, is motivated by time pressure. So as the clock ticks down, the wheels in my brain really start churning kind of at hyperspeed, right? And so that is, it's a thing. And it is a thing that has both pros and cons, both strengths and weaknesses, right? Strengths and vulnerabilities. The strength of it is that it works. It's really dependable. I can always count on time pressure to push me along. I always know that as I get closer to a deadline, I will feel super motivated and honed in and like my brain is firing on all cylinders to get it done, right? Also, there's almost always time pressure and I can almost always create it, right? I can't always create interest. I can't always create competition. I can't always create all the novelty, all the other things that motivate brains, but I can almost always create time pressure by just waiting long enough. It's pretty easy. And so it's super dependable, and it's super effective. And so that's wonderful, has great strengths, but of course it also has a downside, right? That it doesn't always kick in early enough to get it done, right? Or it's early enough to get it done, but not early enough to kind of perfect it or to smooth out the rough edges or whatever. The other thing that can happen here with using time pressure is that for some folks, that time pressure ends up resulting in anxiety, right? And then progress gets halted by this kind of reactive avoidance to anxiety. It's kind of a like, oh, I don't want to go there. That's big and hard and scary. And so there's some avoidance. And so progress gets halted that way. So I give a lot of talks, and talks tend to kind of be these like large, somewhat amorphous things that I have to hone in on. They're big things, right? They're big tasks. And so this for a long time, when I would give a talk, I would use time pressure because I could depend on it, and because it was a thing that would propel me, and I would be up all night and would find myself kind of A, tired, and B, like I hadn't really been able to have the time to do what I needed to do. I'm sorry that is not showing up. I don't know why. Oh well. And so I have done what I have eventually after several years of that not going so well, I started to do what I was so often recommending for clients, which was really breaking up this task knowing that there will be a million other shiny, compelling things to do that had more inherent pressure and motivation built in early on, right? And knowing that that time pressure wasn't going to kick in until a week before. And so what I did was create real but manufactured deadlines for pieces of the task, right? And there are a variety of ways to do this. I did this for a long time with a speech coach, and now I've done it with other people in my life, where I create these kind of little pieces of a project, right? And have a very real deadline for this piece needs to be done by this time. And by having somebody else that I am accountable to, it makes it real, as opposed to me just being like, yes, by Tuesday, I'll have this part done. And we all know how that goes. Definitely not happening. But if it's a, yes, by Tuesday, I will, at 2:00, I will show you this whole thing. Now all of a sudden I have some skin in the game, right? Because now there's like some embarrassment, or, you know, something's going to happen if I don't have that ready. And so we break this big task into smaller tasks, right? And it allows me to still use time pressure. It's still, you know, so Tuesday at 2, I have this piece done, due. Great. I'll probably start working on it Tuesday at 12, because that's when the motivation is going to kind of really start to formulate. But it's a smaller piece, and that big deadline, right, the big talk or whatever it is, exists farther away. And so there's still room for that perfecting. So I get to use the thing that works for me while still kind of shoring up and protecting against that vulnerability. Because being motivated by time pressure, it's a strategy, and it's kind of a great one. We can always create time pressure. And good practical supports use our brain's natural tendency, but they build in these guardrails, right, against that tendency's kind of more perilous inclinations. And there are tons of ways of doing that, tons of ways of saying, we don't need to abolish all ADHD tendencies, right? We don't need to just force ADHD brains to work like neurotypical brains. We can instead use the ADHD brain's kind of natural gifts, their natural energies, to their benefit, while steering away from the vulnerabilities. So the key to doing this, why are all these pictures not showing up? So the key to doing this, sorry about that, is to have these ADHD friendly systems and supports and making them external. So we want any system or support should be an external support. It should exist outside of our brains, right? So in my example, the system existed outside of me. It was a person who I was accountable to. It was there were also other systems involved, right, of kind of like breaking it out and writing it down and having it very clear and defined. But the really important thing here is that it's outside of our brains. So, for example, instead of, you just have to start remembering to take the trash out, or I just have to. This is always a big thing that whenever I hear this, that phrase, I just have to, is always kind of red flag of like, oh, we might need to find a new system here, because I just have to. I just have to start is almost always a recipe for shame, for disappointment, for, you know, feeling like nothing's going to work, right? So I just have to start remembering to take the trash out. It hasn't happened thus far. It's probably not going to happen now. So instead, an external structure would be, let's set a recurring alarm on Wednesday night to take the trash out, right? I know alarms are, there's a lot, they're not a perfect strategy by any stretch. There's a lot of that's wrong with alarms. But they are also useful in some instances. So let's set an alarm, a recurring alarm, a system that happens outside of me, to provide that prompting. Okay, so of the practical interventions, we have regulatory, we have supports and strategies. The final one is skills-based. The thing that makes skills different from supports and strategies is that they're internal, right? So the supports and strategies are external, they're outside of our brains, outside of us. There are systems that kind of help prop us up and keep us from those vulnerabilities or those guardrails. The skills are internal. They're knowing how to do things, right? So they're learning how to use a planner, learning how to meal plan, learning how to set actionable goals. Those of you who are here because you have kids with ADHD, you know, these are skills that we're teaching our kids, right? These are the things of, okay, so here's what a planner is, and here's how you can use it. Here's how to do a task list. Here's how to break down an assignment into smaller pieces. Those are the skills. The supports are the things that actually help get us to do those skills, right? They're the things that actually look at, oh, how do we work best? And what skills can we use and partner with this kind of thing outside of our brain to make sure that we're doing them? And that leads us to emotional. So the emotional part of the ADHD experience is something that I'm really grateful that we're finally talking about these days in the ADHD world. It took a very long time, but increasing information, research, study, discussion all around the emotional effects and impact and experience of ADHD, and really kind of noting, hey, this is just as much a part of ADHD as all the other stuff, as the attention, as the focus, as the hyperactivity and impulsivity. Emotion is really a big part of this too. In fact, 24 to 50%, so this is a large meta-analysis, hence a large variation in numbers there, of children with ADHD show what we call impairing levels. Emotional dysregulation that really impacts their life in a negative way. And 34 to 70% of adults with ADHD show these impairing levels of emotional dysregulation. I think that this is a particularly interesting side-by-side and comparison, because when we look at this, right, it is on its face a little surprising. Why is it that adults are struggling with this more than kids? When we think about kids, particularly kids with ADHD, we think big feelings, right? And those big feelings are going to have an impact. And they do. But what this slide is really speaking to is that the realm of what is expected and what we expect of people is much more narrow for adults, right? We give a lot of allowance for kids. And so if you steal a toy from a kid and he, starts screaming and crying and throwing things and hitting, that's not great for sure. Nobody's enjoying that. But it's probably not going to impact their life that much, at least in that one instance, right? If you grab something out of an adult's hand and they start screaming and crying and throwing things and hitting people, it's going to have a much greater impact. That emotional dysregulation is much more impairing for adults than it is for kids. So where does this emotional dysregulation come from? So part of it is the regulation difference, right? Part of it is this on-off switch, and that emotions kind of happen in that way too. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but for simplicity's sake tonight, we're going to talk about how ADHD emotions tend to kind of flood in this very on way, big, strong feelings, or they kind of tend to be off, and it's just like, I'm not feeling much at all. We're good. We're doing other things, right? The other thing that happens for ADHD emotions is that there are a lot of hypersensitivities, and there's a tendency for ADHD brains to not kind of flex and move. So what I mean by that is I like to think of ADHD brains as being, if you imagine neurotypical brains as being like a very fancy club, right, with like a VIP and a bouncer out front. And that bouncer is saying like, you're important, you can come in. Oh, nope, you're not important, you can't come in, right? And so neurotypical brains have that kind of bouncer out front that's keeping everything out at bay that isn't supposed to be there, and the things that are supposed to come in, they get to come in. ADHD brains are more like an outdoor party, right? And there's no bouncer to be seen, and they're open to the elements. Anything that goes by kind of comes in, the bugs, the rain, the wind. But also, let's not forget, outdoor parties are pretty great sometimes. But when that happens, when we have this kind of bouncerless system, right, it's a nervous system that doesn't filter out information, it's constantly bombarded. And when it's bombarded, it feels like it's under attack. And so it gets kind of, it tenses up against that attack, kind of like this brain here. And so add that kind of tension of a bombarded system with difficulty kind of flexing and moving with what happens. And it can really result in some very big feelings, right? Because we're kind of already at our max. And anything that's going to shift or change is going to kind of break us over the top. And then the final one is history and trauma, that ADHD brains have lived for a long time in a world not well suited for their brain, right? That hasn't supported them, hasn't given us the support and structure and all of the benefits that they gave all of the neurotypical brains, and without any understanding of kind of what was going on there. And so that history is a lot to carry around. And the truth is that ADHD brains are also more prone to trauma. And that's what we call in the psychology world, both big T trauma, so like the rape and murder and attacks and that sort of thing, but also little T trauma, which are kind of the smaller but still really impactful over and over repeated struggles. And so this whole picture creates some really big feelings, right? And it creates what's technically known as emotional dysregulation, and it is, you can see this in a lot of different ways. You can see this in overwhelming feelings, right? Really big, hard feelings. We see this in kind of lots of fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. We see numbness, right? The opposite of those big feelings, that kind of lack of awareness of, I don't know, I'm not feeling much at all. And we see a lot of rejection sensitivity. But it also shows up like this. It also shows up as infectious enthusiasm and interest and engagement, hilarity, all-encompassing love. I was at the playground with a friend of mine and her young kid and my kid. And my friend has ADHD, and her son was kind of off playing. And she and I were talking, and our son came over, and you could see that he was kind of trying to get her attention. And he looked fine. He looked a little kind of down. He wasn't really getting her attention. And she eventually noticed, and knelt down and started talking to him. And you could see her just kind of put all of her love and all of her attention on him. And you should have seen the way this kid lit up, right? Like he just blossomed. You could see he like grew a couple inches. Like he was like this wilting flower that just blossomed under her light, because she was so able to give him all of her, right? In a way that neurotypical brains just don't do very often. ADHD brains can do this beautifully, of this real interest and engagement. And that the big feelings on this kind of good side are amazing and have incredible benefit. But they have vulnerabilities, and so we want to look at the strategies for those vulnerabilities too. So again, we have 3 types of strategies here. And the first is always going to be the regulatory. And, you know, this probably feels even more clear to us, right? Like if you don't get enough sleep, I don't know about you guys, but when my kids were babies and I was not getting enough sleep at all, I was a mess, right? I was crying. I was like, anything that happened was the worst thing in the world. And that is just kind of one example of the impact of these regulatory capacities on emotions, right? So if we're not getting enough sleep, if we're hangry, that's gonna get us, right? That low blood sugar is gonna make the emotions much bigger and stronger. And then if we don't have our boosters, then we're going to be less resilient against these things too, right? If we don't take our meds, if we haven't been meditating, if we haven't been around people in a while, haven't gotten that good connection, if we've been feeling really isolated and alone, and then if we're not exercising, we're not going to have that extra resilience that's going to allow us to kind of find more of a middle ground with our emotions. We also have therapies, right? CBT, ACT, DBT, all the letters. Psychodynamic therapy. These are all therapies that have been proven to help folks find that middle ground emotionally, right? And of course, deal with the trauma and that repeated exposure of living in the world with a brain that the world's kind of not well suited for. And then we have skills and supports. And so skills and supports are ADHD emotion regulation training, relaxation training, right? Again, the things that we can put inside of us, the things that we can learn how to do. Therapies often help us in the same way that the strategies help us kind of enact it. The skills really help us learn how to do it, and then the therapies can help us actually put it in place. But so we have all 3 of these, and they're all super important. But it's important that we address all sides of this equation, right? Because it's all connected. Each corner of the triad can pull the others up or down. So this happens in lots of different ways. Let's look at a couple examples. So let's just say that you have gotten a great new med regimen, right? You got new meds that they're working really, really well. You got a great night's sleep. And you wake up one morning, you pop your meds, feeling really good, right? And you go downstairs, and you woke up, you're in a great mood. And so you have your cup of coffee, you take your planner out, and you start planning your day. And so you figure out kind of where things are going to fit, you think things ahead, and you're really kind of able to kind of see like what's going to fit where, right? That allows you to get a lot of your work done that day. It allows you to cross a couple things off your list, and things are feeling pretty smooth and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And so when you come home that night and your kids are fighting, you're actually able to weather that storm. And, maybe you don't handle it perfectly, exactly how you wanted, but you don't yell. You're able to kind of, do the things that you've been intending to do. And there's no big blow up. And so everybody ends up going to bed that night on time, feeling relatively good and connected. And you sleep really well because, hey, you had a great day. And you wake up the next morning and you do it all over again, right? And so this cycle kind of goes in this cycle, and it kind of works in this way. It can work up in this way, right? That when one thing goes well, it makes the next thing easier to go well. It makes the next thing easier to go well, and they all play in together. But of course, it can happen the other way too. So, for example, maybe you wake up and you didn't the night before set out your clothes, right? That you had been intending to set out your clothes for the next day with your gym bag and everything that you needed. You didn't do that. And you end up oversleeping. And so you press snooze one too many times. You're late. You don't have time. You just throw on some clothes, run out the door. And you're feeling kind of frantic, right? And so you're in the car, there's traffic, you're feeling more and more frantic because you're supposed to be at work, you're supposed to be at the meeting, and you're going to be late. And so that you feel that tension building up. You're definitely honking on the horn quite a bit. You get into work, and you're already kind of like revved, right? And feeling really bad about yourself because you're late. You said you wouldn't be late. This was an important meeting. And here you are kind of frazzled and late. And so that meeting doesn't go so well. And you end up kind of having to play catch up. You're feeling bad about yourself. And so then you go to your office and you end up kind of procrastinating because you're feeling bad about yourself. You go spiral through a TikTok loop, and you're late. You don't get your work done. You end up not going to the gym that night. And that not going to the gym means that you also kind of don't sleep as well that night, right? So then you wake up the next morning late again, and the cycle continues. So you see how this is all connected, right? That the practical, the emotional, the regulatory, they all interrelate, which is why it's so important to really keep this balance, right? To really be looking at all three sides of this triad and making sure that we're addressing all of them. And it's part of what I often call the multifactorial magic of ADHD. So I have lots of folks who come to me who say that they feel like some kind of mythical being is granting either success or failure, right, from on high, right? They'll say things like, I don't know why, sometimes I can, sometimes I can't, right? Sometimes it's like all the stars aligned and everything worked, and then other times it just doesn't. And it feels like we have no impact on that, right? That nothing there is something that we could do anything about. And it's not that way, actually. It feels that way. It very much feels that way. But it's actually not magical. It's just multifactorial. There's so many different factors that go into making an ADHD brain feel like it's either rowing upstream or rowing downstream. So, for example, how much sleep did we get, right? Did we take our meds that day? Did we get enough connection? Did we get our workout in? Did we eat well enough? And did we eat recently enough? Did our emotions kind of get in the way, get really big, or sideline us in some way? Did we have systems in place to protect against the vulnerability? Or were our emotions kind of roiling under the surface, pushing us to avoid or distract? And I don't know about you, but multifactorial algebra is about where I checked out as a kid. Because our brains don't like having to hold on to too many variables long enough to see the patterns, right? And so we tend to hone in on one particular factor. We focus on one thing, and that's what we track. And when we track only one thing, when we notice only one corner of the triad, it's incomplete. And we all do this. We all hone in on one spot or another. And it's people with ADHD, professionals, partners, all of us, parents, we all have a spot on the triad where we tend to go first, right? And either that's because that's where we've had success in the past, either that's because that's where our tools lie or our training lies. But regardless, we tend to kind of get stuck. And the stuck is where the frustration lives. And it's where we feel like we want to give up and where we feel like nothing works. And it's where we start looking for other diagnoses or other treatments or other explanations or like the newest, hottest TikTok trend, right? Whatever it is that could just kind of get us out of this thing. But when we zoom out and we broaden our perspective and we look at all sides of the triangle, all aspects of the equation, that's when we're really able to grasp our true ability to support and celebrate and make change. Because every single one of us here tonight, and all of us in the ADHD community, we have the power to help reduce the suffering for ADHD brains. And maybe we also have the power to reduce the struggle too. We may be able to help ourselves or ADHD brains that we know or care for or love build the scaffolding that supports our natural weaknesses. And that has tremendous power. But our greatest potential, our greatest power is our ability to reduce the suffering, to pull back that invisibility cloak on the race that we're all running, right? And to see it for what it is. Systems that we humans created and developed for the neurotypical norm. And instead of just doing that, right, instead of just running that race and pretending that was totally normal, we can celebrate and support the natural tendencies of ADHD brains, right? There isn't anything inherently better about neurotypical brains. There's nothing that's inherently better that's pushing them ahead. It's the race that's getting them there. It's the race that's built for them that gets them ahead. And when we notice that, when we truly acknowledge and see the neurotypical norm for what it is, that it's like a hand pushing on their back, then and acting like a strong headwind that's pushing ADHD brains back, when we can finally stop misattributing that struggle to who we are as people, and finally stop layering shame and suffering onto that struggle and assuming that neurotypical way of being is right, and any deviation from that is a sign of deficiency, that's when we can really kind of take that suffering off of the ADHD experience. That's when we can really find that balance, right? That balance where we just say, okay, here are the strengths, here are the vulnerabilities, and how are we going to deal with these, right? In the same way that we've been doing it for neurotypical brains forever. So that's what I have for you guys tonight. Would love to hear questions. And I will just quickly show, these are places where you can find me: Rittenhouse Psych, adept.org, Meltdown to Mastery. As I said, we're changing our name, but you'll still be able to find us at Rittenhouse Psych for a long time to come. So what questions are there?
I'm going to stop the recording too. So if
Sure.